This video looks at the global political challenge of the environment. More specifically, by looking at Indonesia and the environmental damage from palm oil farming, answers the question, to what extent has the government mitigated environmental damage from palm oil farming? Palm oil is an edible vegetable oil made from the fruit of oil palm trees. The oil is found in a huge number of products, like pizza, chocolate, shampoo, toothpaste, makeup and biofuel. The reason for this is due to the oil's chemical properties, such as a long shelf life, semi-solid state at room temperature and odorless and colorless qualities. The crop itself is also incredibly efficient, able to produce large quantities of oil in a small area and requiring far less resources to maintain than competitor crops, making for a very attractive crop for producers at any scale, from local farmers to mega plantations. So then why is palm oil so often reported about negatively in global media? Well, the issues surrounding palm oil don't come from the oil itself, rather the methods used to produce it. Palm oil is grown in the tropics, where rain forests are the natural environment. This means that to grow the palm, rain forests must be cleared. The area of lost rainforest globally is substantial, especially as demand for the oil grows. The WWF predicts that every hour globally, 300 football pitches worth of rainforests are cleared every hour. This inevitably results in a range of environmental impacts, such as a loss of carbon sink that is not replaced by the replanting of palm oil trees, contributing to human-induced climate change, a loss of associated environmental nutrient cycles, a loss of biodiversity and loss of other protective features associated with rainforests, like flood prevention and soil erosion. Even worse, the primary method for clearing rainforest, especially in the last few decades, has been slash and burn techniques. The resulting forest fires release millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, where it contributes to human-induced climate change, and smoke from fires can travel for thousands of miles and obscure skies for days. The usefulness of palm oil therefore comes with significant and lasting environmental costs. The extent to which these environmental costs can be mitigated by a government can be illustrated by a closer look at Indonesia. Indonesia is a large archipelago nation in South Asia, home to the third largest rainforest on the planet, where the production of palm oil has been increasing over a period of 50 years, with increasing rates peaking in 2015. Partially driven by global demand and the Jevons paradox, the process of which domestic economic development leads to changing and increasing patterns of demand, Indonesia now produces around 60% of the world's palm oil, and plantations cover an area approximately the size of England. This grants the industry great economic significance. After coal and petroleum, it is the country's third most profitable export, and the business employs an estimated 3.7 million people. Production of palm oil is therefore a major contributor to Indonesia's social and economic development and, from this angle, can be considered a success for the country's realist interests, as the country is exploiting its own resources for self-benefit. Inevitably, this expansion into Indonesian forests has had grave effects on the environment. Slash and burn has led to the occurrence of mega fires, which can grow so large that smoke reaches neighboring countries. So much carbon dioxide is produced from these fires that in 2016 forest clearing in Indonesia produced the same amount of carbon dioxide as the entirety of the economy of Brazil. To make matters worse, the removal of forest has also led to massive flooding in the country due to a lack of natural defense removed by monoculture plantations, and clearing has destroyed the habitats of millions of species, with the famous example of Sumatran and Bornean orangutan becoming critically endangered on their respective islands. Although Indonesia has signed several international agreements on forest governance, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, governance has been slow to address the environmental impact of palm oil production. Prior to 2015, the government had taken a laissez-faire approach to palm oil-related environmental issues, focusing more on the total expansion of a profitable industry sector. This is in contrast to the approach of the second largest palm oil producer, neighboring Malaysia, which as far back as 1992 had pledged to maintain 50% forest cover, steering oil palm policy away from expansion and toward technology-driven intensification and regulated development. Policy only began to really factor in environmental concerns after the 2015 mega fires, caused by small farmers expanding their palm farmland, which burned 2.6 million hectares of rainforest, causing not only mass environmental harm but also 19 human deaths and 500,000 cases of respiratory illnesses. Although governments have a range of mechanisms available to them to act on issues, such as taxation or development in alternative incomes, initial response was focused around controlling further expansion. This was due to the high economic dependence on the palm oil industry and the lack of any short-term consequences for maintaining current production standards. The 2015 response of the Indonesian government was therefore limited to the strengthening and enforcing of legislation around forest governance and company behavior. This appeared to have some success. The government staged 21 court lawsuits, with 3 big palm oil firms having their licenses withdrawn for illegal expansion, and 64 administrative sanctions imposed on more firms. 3 key executives from 2 palm oil corporations were also detained by the Corruption Eradication Commission. They were sentenced to 20 months in jail as a result of their actions. However, the impact of this approach was diluted by further corruption, compromise and injustice within Indonesia's legal system. Local and indigenous community complaints about major companies' palm activities were usually rejected by official organizations, and, when complaints did turn to court cases, more often than not, the firms got off with little to no repercussions. This is because local authorities and politicians often needed tight relationships with the palm sector in order to fund their election campaigns, and so political will to impose too many restrictions on business was limited. This led to local public and global onlookers' skepticism as to the effectiveness of the environmental protection policies. The most successful action to date were likely President Widodo's moratoriums, which aimed to stop this illegal deforestation. Funded by Norway to make up for lost profits, the strategy called for a major assessment of palm oil licensing data by key central government departments and provincial governments, in addition to a block on new deforesting licenses. This resulted in forest loss in Indonesia decreasing by 60% between 2016 and 2017, thanks primarily to the moratorium. Following this success and increasing international pressure, Widodo issued a presidential order in 2018 to impose a second moratorium, which, despite expiring in 2021, when in action had the lowest forest clearing rates in decades. Although claims from Greenpeace stated that this was primarily due to the coronavirus pandemic and an especially wet season limiting fires. And despite issues with expansion projects granted before the moratorium acting outside of jurisdiction, overall, both moratoria were huge successes, demonstrating the government's capability to prioritize conservation over capitalistic profits and capacity to do so effectively. Around this time, the global political recognition of, and willingness to address environmental issues began to accelerate further. This led to international pressure for Indonesia to increase more sustainable production. This pressure was reinforced in 2019 when the European Union, a major palm oil import partner, strengthened its biofuels restrictions, using its influence and Indonesia's dependency on European imports to reduce the use of unsustainable palm. Despite strong resistance from Indonesian officials, the pressure did lead to the creation of the Indonesian Sustainable Palm Oil Standard. This self-proclaimed national oil palm sustainability standard is based on current Indonesian legislation and is necessary for all oil palm firms. All state crops must adhere to sustainable methods, which limit environmental damage within plantations as well as prohibit the use of fire for land clearance. The government has also set the development of palm plantation areas on non-forested, abandoned and degraded land, instead of expanding into rainforests in an attempt to maintain the vital role the forests play. Unfortunately, the specific strategy to achieve this is neither well explained nor easily traceable, which explains some of the many flaws which limit this potentially vital standard. The ISPO is attempting to assist domestic oil palm producers, processors, and exporters satisfy expanding international demand for sustainably certified palm oil. This liberalist global cooperation is in the interest of not only Indonesia but the wider market. The ISPO paints an appealing picture of the future: more money, jobs, and development for nations without generating deforestation, land clearing fires, or community strife. However, the expansion-oriented and trade-focused business of sustainable palm oil firms derive profits from a highly fragmented and poorly managed sector. In fact, according to a government audit released this year, still 81% of palm oil farms violated rules and continued to expand, ignoring sustainability criteria and avoiding repercussions. To compensate businesses further, the government has set up a land exchange program that allows firms to access more unprotected territory. More than a quarter of the peatlands designated for preservation in 2015 had already been sold to palm oil and wood companies at auction. We can see here that sustainable certifications are used more to pacify critics and reassure customers than to genuinely enhance management, as the ISPO is unable to effectively enforce the certifications due to its lack of power over the industry. Even more concerning is that Indonesia has been swamped in recent months by a dramatic surge in coronavirus infections, prompting environmentalists to warn that authorities may turn to the palm oil sector to lead an economic recovery. Even the notion of a new permanent moratorium was dropped in favor of a heavily protested jobs bill to help the economy recover from the COVID recession. Congress passed an omnibus bill which ushered in a surge of deregulation across the industry, including the rollback of environmental restrictions and the encouragement of extractive industries like mining and, of course, plantations. One of the omnibus law's key concessions to the industry effectively legalizes illegal burning. It gives plantation operators a 3-year grace period to obtain the necessary permits and pay off concessions, all while being able to continue practices outside of the ISPO. The bill also shifts decision-making authority for ecologically critical projects from local to central government. The rule is seen as a major setback since it downplays the value of environmental licensing and undermines the effectiveness of monitoring procedures. The transition of power is especially concerning since deforestation is increasing in regions that are more vulnerable to favorable palm oil price shocks in the run-up to local elections. As politicians believe that boosting agricultural growth will provide them with short-term electoral gains. We can see from this study of Indonesia's policies that although the rate of forest cover loss in Indonesia has been reducing since 2015 with a major dip in 2020, and although policymakers in Indonesia have proved they have the capacity and desire to act effectively through arrests, moratoria and ISPO, the lack of overall enforcement of illegalities and lack of a permanent moratorium shows how the country is still incentivizing realist interests like profit and power over maintaining the natural environment of Indonesia and the wider world. Indonesian palm oil has shown us that the environment always has to come up against other interests like capitalism, and although solutions are possible, the selfish desires of countries, companies and people make those solutions hard to reach. And so in answering the question as to what extent has the government mitigated environmental damage from palm oil farming, we can see that damage has only been mitigated to a limited degree. It is also evident that this issue has massive implications beyond Indonesia, and that understanding adapting to these issues is imperative to the future of the world, especially as the palm oil demand increases globally and plantations expand across into Africa. Mitigating environmental damage will be an increasingly pressing issue.